Hello, my name is Ezenwa Ongbenu, and the topic of this discussion is how to resolve hypertension naturally. Now, hypertension refers to chronically elevated blood pressure. And as with any chronic state, it is a whole body phenomenon. But we can simplify this analysis to the organ system that is most directly involved, which is the cardiovascular system. And the cardiovascular system comprises of the heart and a network of blood vessels, so your arteries, your veins, and capillaries. So here is a diagram of an artery, and we can conceptualize the artery as a sort of pipe through which blood flows. And blood is basically water in which various cells are suspended, such as red blood cells and white blood cells, and other substances such as proteins like albumin. So with that being said, blood pressure refers to the pressure with which blood, as it flows through this artery, pushes up against the inner wall. So it's a measure of the resistance of flow of blood through the artery. And the heart, which drives the system, which is the central pump, is not a continuous pump like an electric motor. It has periods in which it fills up with blood and then periods when it contracts. So there is a pulsatile flow of blood that corresponds with periods of contraction and periods of filling up. And that is why when we measure blood pressure, there are two numbers. This higher number, referred to as systole, is when the heart is contracting, when there is maximum flow through the system. Hence, there is more pressure pushing up against the inner wall of the artery. And then this lower number, which is diastole, corresponds with when the heart is filling up with blood before it pushes again. And during that period, there is less blood flow through the artery, and hence there is less pressure pushing up against the arterial wall. Now, conventional treatments for hypertension involve various synthetic drugs. And one thing that will become quite apparent is the limitations of synthetic drugs in the resolution of hypertension, because the basic problem is that they don't get to the heart of the matter. Because hypertension is not really a disease if you think about it. It is merely a symptom of an underlying pathology, of an underlying disease process. Because the most salient question in hypertension is, what is the cause of chronically elevated blood pressure? So chronically elevated blood pressure is a result of something else. And that something else is the key. Because once we understand what that something else is, and then we now tackle that something else, then we now resolve high blood pressure, which is merely a symptom. Now, unfortunately, the pharmaceutical approach takes hypertension as the disease, and that is the limitation, and that is why you can take drugs for months to years, but you never really get better. And in many ways, the underlying disease process is unfolding or even accelerating. So in many ways, if you limit your approach to tackling hypertension with only synthetic drugs, it is as if one is fiddling while Rome is burning. So let's just quickly look at three classes of synthetic drugs and look at their mode of action. Then we can also understand how limited they are. So one class is diuretics, another is the beta blocker, and another is ACE inhibitors. And we will examine all three in the context of an artery. Now, a diuretic increases urine output, so it increases the excretion of water from the body. And recall, blood is substantially water. So when you reduce water in the body, you also reduce blood volume. And when there is less blood volume, there is less pressure pushing up against the inner wall of the artery. Therefore, there is a lowering of blood pressure. Now, with the beta blocker, you inhibit the action of primarily two hormones, adrenaline and noradrenaline. And one of the effects of the inhibition of these hormones is that there is a reduction in cardiac output. So when the heart contracts, it contracts less vigorously, so there is less blood that is pushed out. So the reduction of blood flow also reduces the resistance to that blood flow, and there is also a reduction of pressure against the inner wall, and there is thereby a lowering of blood pressure. The ACE inhibitor, which stands for angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor, inhibits the action of an enzyme, angiotensin, that causes the constriction of blood vessels. Notice that if I reduce the diameter of an artery, there will be less room for the blood to flow through, and therefore there will be more pressure against the inner wall of the artery, hence higher blood pressure. But if I inhibit this constriction and basically relax the blood vessel, there will be more room for blood to flow through, and there will be a lowering of blood pressure. But again, all these interventions, which are by no means the full gauntlet of synthetic drugs that are used in the treatment of hypertension, but from this we get a sense that all we're doing is just manipulating blood pressure, but not the underlying problem. So what are some of the underlying problems of which elevated blood pressure is merely a symptom? Well, there are several, because the body is exceedingly complex, but a very important one is insulin resistance. When the body loses sensitivity to the action of insulin, because typically we think of insulin in the context of blood sugar and maybe diabetes, but the action or the scope of activity of insulin in the body is really vast. Insulin plays important roles in the storage of proteins, of sugars, of fats, of cholesterol, of genetic material like DNA, RNA. It plays a role in cell growth, cell division. It plays critical roles in the brain with memory and cognition, just to name a few. And insulin plays very, very important role in the development of hypertension. And when there is a derangement in insulin signaling, that is a root cause that now leads to hypertension. So, what are some ways in which insulin resistance can drive up blood pressure in a chronic fashion? One way is that insulin resistance increases the formation and expansion of plaques in the arteries, because again, blood pressure is a measurement of the resistance to the flow of blood. And if we imagine the arteries as a pipe, these plaques are like little blockages in that pipe, and they prevent the free flow of blood. And these plaques, also referred to as atheromas, are largely comprised of cholesterol, other fatty substances, and also some cells. Now, the role of insulin in the development of these atheromas is largely downstream, and it has to do with its effect on the liver, because cholesterol is made in the body primarily by the liver. And the liver, its production of cholesterol is regulated by insulin. When the liver loses sensitivity to insulin, when cholesterol production in the liver is no longer effectively controlled by insulin, the liver produces excess cholesterol. It produces abnormal amounts of cholesterol. And this cholesterol can get deposited in these atheromas, because when there is an abnormal level of cholesterol in circulation, it is now more easily damaged. It can become oxidized by various oxidants that are also in the blood. And this damaged cholesterol is now deposited in these atheromas. So in this way, elevated levels of insulin drives cholesterol production in the liver, and a lot of that excess cholesterol can now be damaged and now deposited in these atheromas, which now occlude or block arteries and now increase the resistance to the flow of blood, driving up blood pressure. Another way in which insulin can drive up blood pressure is that insulin also plays a role in the balance of what they call autonomic tone. And autonomic tone is a reference to the involuntary nervous system. It's a network of nerves that are not under our conscious control, but that innervate the entire body and are important in the regulation of the function of many organs. So arteries are also innervated by this autonomic nervous system. So there are nerves, so this is a nerve fiber that is in contact with this artery, and these nerve fibers control muscles, smooth muscles that are embedded in the walls of the arteries that control its constriction and its dilation. So these muscles control the diameter of the blood vessels. When you have insulin resistance, that is chronically elevated levels of insulin, it alters the balance of these nerve signals in a direction that constrict these blood vessels. So it reduces the diameter, so there's less room for blood to flow through, hence there is higher blood pressure. Another way in which insulin drives up blood pressure is that insulin is also critical for the storage of various minerals. And when there is a loss of sensitivity to insulin in various tissues in the body, there tends to be an increased excretion of magnesium. And magnesium is critical in the body for the relaxation of blood vessels, for the expansion, for the dilation of blood vessels. So insulin resistance promotes magnesium deficiency, and magnesium deficiency limits the ability of the body to relax blood vessels. Basically, most blood vessels are now constitutively constricted, and that elevates blood pressure through the system. So, getting to the root of resolving hypertension, we cannot bypass this issue of insulin resistance. Now, a very good question is that what is the cause of insulin resistance? Insulin resistance is really a result of our highly processed food diet, and the statistics bear this out, because if we look at the incidence of hypertension, we find that from like the 1970s onwards, when this highly processed food diet really became the substance, the core of what we ate, there was a skyrocketing of a lot of chronic diseases, of which hypertension was just one. So more specifically, certain aspects of processed food, most especially refined carbohydrates. And refined carbohydrates are your white sugar, your high fructose corn syrup, your white flour. So we're talking about things like soft drinks, packaged fruit juices, malt drinks, white bread, instant noodles, various sorts of pastas that are made from white flour as well, and then also vegetable oil. And if we look at the statistics and we look at the incidence or the increase in consumption of these two categories of food, it is striking the correlation between increased consumption of refined carbohydrates and vegetable oil and the incidence of a lot of chronic diseases. So briefly, refined carbohydrates cause insulin resistance because these carbohydrates rapidly break down into sugar in the body, and that causes a spike in blood sugar. Now, in response to that spike in blood sugar, the pancreas also releases a burst of insulin, because that insulin is necessary to signal to the body to absorb that sugar out of circulation and store it. Now, when we consume refined carbohydrates consistently, there are regular spikes in blood sugar, and also there are spikes in insulin. And these abnormal levels of insulin over time causes the body to lose sensitivity to insulin. and then you now end up with chronically elevated levels of insulin. But the real cause of the derangement is the abnormal amount of sugar that is released when we eat and digest these highly processed foods that contain refined carbohydrates. Now, vegetable oils operate through a different mechanism, because vegetable oils like soybean oil, canola oil, corn oil, and a few others, these highly liquid oils, they are naturally unstable. So they are preserved by a process called hydrogenation. And it is that hydrogenation that gives vegetable oil its shelf life, because natural soybean oil goes rancid in a matter of days when exposed to the air. So vegetable oils are hydrogenated, but this hydrogenation creates an unnatural fat called trans fats. And these trans fats are a metabolic poison. They really disrupt many hormonal systems in the body. They cause the breakdown of many hormonal signaling pathways in the body, of which insulin is just one. Vegetable oils are a terrible food. Now, unfortunately, in this environment here in Nigeria, there is a lot of marketing about the health benefits of vegetable oil, and it is the most unfortunate thing, because vegetable oil is at the root of so many chronic diseases, of which hypertension is just one. Now, how vegetable oil drives insulin resistance is a different mechanism, because your cells have insulin receptors. So let's call that IR. And then there are insulin molecules. Now, for the action of insulin to actually work in the body, this insulin molecule has to link with this receptor, and then a message is now communicated into the interior of the cell that now creates the altered behavior. Let's say, for example, the uptake of sugar from circulation. But that uptake of sugar from circulation will only occur when there is the effective union of the insulin molecule and the insulin receptor, and then the downstream communication of that signal to other cellular machinery. Now, the trans fats in vegetable oil interrupt this signal both at this level, at the union of insulin and the insulin receptor, and also at this level, the communication of this bounded molecule, the transference of that information to the interior of the cell. So, with that being said, an important part of resolving hypertension will involve the removal of these offending foods from the diet. Now, if we're able to cut back on intake of refined carbohydrates, cut back on soft drinks, cut back on white bread, and all these packaged things, cut back on fried foods, cut back on cooking with vegetable oil, we can replace vegetable oil with palm oil, with coconut oil. And those oils are much more safer because they are naturally stable due to their saturated fat content, so they are not hydrogenated. But these highly liquid oils, due to their natural instability, are all hydrogenated, and it's that hydrogenation that's really the problem with vegetable oils. Now, if we're able to cut back on these foods, we have gone a long way in the resolution of hypertension, because the resolution of hypertension is really of two things. It's the cutting back of certain offending foods, and then the increased intake of certain health-promoting foods. Now, another thing I would like to discuss is the sodium-potassium ratio, because typically doctors give the advice to reduce salt intake if you're hypertensive. That is okay. It's not a bad advice, because sodium, which is a constituent of salt, promotes water retention. And recall, blood is also water, substantially water. So if there's increased water retention in the body, there's increased blood volume as well. And increased blood volumes means that there's more blood pushing up against the interior of the arterial wall, and that increases blood pressure. But more important than the absolute amount of sodium in the diet is the ratio between sodium and potassium, the sodium-potassium ratio. And this is where many doctors lose the plot, because this is the most important relationship between sodium and anything. So, for example, with an ancestral diet, that is before we started eating all this highly processed food that is loaded with salt, and before we started using a lot of table salt in our cooking, the sodium to potassium ratio in the body is 1:1. And this is critical for the control of fluid balance in the body. That is the retention and the excretion of water, and also the distribution of water through the body in various compartments. Now, more important than reducing sodium, it's useful to reduce sodium, don't get me wrong, but it's much more important to increase intake of potassium. And the modern diet, with a lot of packaged foods, with a lot of convenience foods, we don't get many potassium-rich foods. And the potassium-rich foods are primarily fruits and vegetables. And fruits and vegetables are cornerstones of an ancestral diet. That is, your green vegetables, your bananas, your watermelon, your oranges. Those are all great sources of potassium. So when we increase intake of those sorts of foods, we now balance the sodium to potassium ratio, which now helps the body promote the necessary water and fluid balance that will also assist in the normalization of blood pressure. So with that being said, the primary problem is the highly processed food diet, and the solution to the highly processed food diet is an ancestral diet. And an ancestral diet just basically means a simplified diet, avoiding all this packaged and convenient stuff. And notice that the ancestral diet is not really one diet, because it depends on where you are located. Because, of course, all cultures have their own ancestral foods. But one thing we have to notice about ancestral foods is that it is a tried and tested technology. Any ancestral culture has been eating various foods for hundreds of years, and over time most ancestral diets are actually very, very good for the body. And what you find is that it's not only one type of diet. For example, here in like Nigeria, if you're from the southeast, you eat a lot of starchy root vegetables. For example, a lot of cassava, a lot of yam. But if you're from elsewhere, let's say like East Africa, where maybe ancestrally it's a herding society. It's a society that herded cattle. So you eat a lot of milk products, a lot of cattle blood, also a lot of meat products, and much less starch is in the diet. But yet that diet is beneficial for health. Or you can even go to an extreme example, such as like the ancestral cultures that live in the Arctic Circle, where there is almost no agriculture. So you eat almost all fish, seal fat, but yet these diets, despite the fact that their ratios of protein to carbohydrate to fat are radically different, all those diets in their own ways make for very good health. So it's for one to discover, one, what is locally available, and the key principle is to move away from refined packaged foods to whole foods that you prepare at home, because that is the nature of ancestral diets. Now, with that being said, another useful practice is to juice certain highly medicinal vegetables that in the literature have been shown to be very, very useful in the resolution of insulin resistance, and thereby lowering blood pressure. And a good combination or a good core would be cabbage, ginger, turmeric, with a dash of pepper. And with pepper, the spicier the better. So for example, you could have like a handful of cabbage, which you finely chop, and then maybe 3 tablespoons of fresh ginger, and also 3 tablespoons of fresh turmeric. And with turmeric, it's best to use fresh turmeric, but If you cannot find fresh turmeric, then you can also use the powdered variety, maybe like 1 tablespoon. So with cabbage, like a handful. Ginger, you can have like 3 tablespoons. Turmeric as well, 3 tablespoons if it is fresh turmeric. And then pepper, you can have like half a teaspoon, because you do not really need too much. And the essence of this pepper is that pepper is an activator of the active ingredients in ginger and turmeric. When you add pepper to ginger and turmeric, you increase the absorption, you increase the bioavailability, and then you also increase the therapeutic action of turmeric and ginger. Now briefly, turmeric in the literature has been shown to be useful in the treatment of over 600 different conditions, both chronic and infectious. And in many ways, turmeric is the closest thing that I have come across in the literature to a universal cure. It is really incredible how medicinal turmeric is. Now these 4 items can form the core of your juicing regimen, and you can do this once or twice a day, but really it's best to at least drink this daily. And you can put all these ingredients in a blender, because for example ginger and turmeric don't really do too well in a conventional juicer. So you can put them in a blender, add some water, maybe a cup of water, you grind them all up, and then you sieve out the solid fraction. Now that juice can form the base to which you now add other fruits, maybe to improve the taste, because of course palatability is very important, because if the taste is not agreeable to you, it might be difficult for you to be consistent with it. So you can add anything else you like, banana, watermelon, apple, orange, lime, but the key is just to have this core, because when you have these the nutrients in these vegetables in your body on a consecutive and consistent basis, they will go a long way to the resolution of the underlying problems that now lead to hypertension. Another very simple practice is to also drink lime water, because lime water is a very rich source of critical minerals, magnesium, calcium, potassium, that help to balance other typical deficiencies that we have in the modern diet. And lime water is much less time consuming than preparing this juice. So that is something that you can drink maybe twice a day. The 2 limes in a cup of water, that goes a long way. And all these things sound very simple. They sound, but they are much, much more effective, and they get much closer to the root of the problem than these synthetic drugs. Now, I hope you found this talk useful. Thank you so much for your time.